They left her to die. Not by accident, not in the chaos of a storm or the blind panic of an emergency. They made a choice, a cold, deliberate, calculated choice. While she was 50 yards away in the trees, her back bent under 60 pounds of firewood, her bad hip burning with every step through the snow. They packed the wagon, they hitched the horses. They looked at the trail ahead, and then they looked at each other, and not one of them, not her father, not her mother, not her brothers who had eaten the meals she cooked and worn the clothes she mended for years, not one of them said, "Wait, we can't leave without her." They left anyway. When Abigail Rowan walked back out of that forest and found nothing but empty ground and the tracks of a wagon moving north at speed, the blizzard was already closing in. She had a flint. She had a knife. She had the clothes on her back and the absolute bone-deep knowledge that the people who were supposed to love her had looked at her size, at her injured leg, at everything they had decided she cost them, and made their decision. She was 23 years old, alone on a mountain in a whiteout storm, and every rational calculation said she should not survive the night. She survived the night. She survived every night after that, and what she built from the wreckage of what her family threw away. The life, the strength, the love she found on the other side of the worst thing that ever happened to her is the story I'm about to tell you. Don't go anywhere. And if this story moves you, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this has traveled. The last thing Abigail Rowan heard before the forest swallowed her whole was the sound of her mother's voice. Not calling after her, not wishing her well, but murmuring something low and tight to her father, the kind of voice people use when they've already made a decision and don't want to be talked out of it. She hadn't thought much of it at the time. She never did. That was perhaps her greatest flaw, and her greatest grace all at once. She believed, against every piece of evidence the world had ever offered her, that people were better than they showed. The morning had begun the way most mornings did on the frontier trail, gray, cold, and swollen, with the smell of wet pine and wood smoke. The Rowan family, Father Gerald, Mother Constance, older brothers Dale and Finn, and their cousin Hester, had made camp the previous night in a shallow clearing just below the Harrow Pass, a cruel scar of rock and ice that cut through the Blackridge Mountains like an old wound that never fully healed. Everyone knew the pass was dangerous in late autumn. Everyone knew the window was closing. 3 days of clear skies, the scout said. Maybe 4. After that, the first true blizzard of the season would seal the pass shut until spring, and anything left on the wrong side of those mountains, man or beast, would simply cease to exist. The wagon was already loaded. Supplies were strapped down. The 2 horses, Knox and Mercy, stood stamping in the cold, breath rising from their nostrils in pale clouds. Abigail had risen before dawn, as she always did, to start the fire and prepare the morning meal. Her hip ached the way it always did in cold weather, a deep, grinding ache that radiated down her left leg like a coal pressed against bone. She'd had the injury for 3 years, the result of a fall from a collapsed barn roof when she was 20. The bone had healed crooked. The pain had never fully left. She didn't complain. She never had. Complaining, in the Rowan household, was considered a personal failing, the kind of thing weak people did. So Abigail moved through the cold morning in her quiet way, stirring the porridge, passing bowls, checking the load on the wagon without being asked. Her brother Dale barely glanced at her. Finn was occupied tightening a wheel bolt. Her father stood apart from the group, studying a hand-drawn map with the focused intensity of a man who was counting something and hoping the numbers came out right. It was her mother who finally spoke to her directly. Abigail. Constance's voice was flat. She was a small, angular woman who had grown smaller and more angular with every mile of the journey, as though the frontier was slowly compressing her into something harder and sharper. "We need more wood before we break camp. Go into the tree line and gather what you can." Abigail looked up from the fire. "How much?" "Enough to last through the crossing. The pass will be cold." She nodded, set down her bowl. She hadn't yet eaten, and picked up the rope they used for bundling wood. Her hip protested immediately as she stepped off the flat ground of the campsite and onto the uneven forest floor. But she adjusted her gait the way she'd learned to do, shifting her weight, favoring her right side. The forest received her in silence. Pine and spruce pressed in thick on both sides of a narrow game trail, the ground beneath a half-foot of snow that had fallen in the night. The light was weak, filtered through heavy clouds that sat low on the mountain peaks, like a lid being placed on something. Abigail worked steadily, snapping dead branches from the lower limbs of fallen trees, gathering them into a bundle that grew heavier with every passing minute. She was not a fast worker by the standards her family had always held her to. Her hip wouldn't allow speed, not on terrain like this. But she was thorough, and she was efficient. She didn't waste motion, didn't stop to rest more than she had to, kept her mind on the task and off the cold that was seeping through her coat in steady increments. By the time she turned back toward camp, the bundle across her shoulders must have weighed close to 60 pounds. Her left leg was burning. The sky had shifted, darker now, the light turned the color of pewter, and a wind had come up from the north that smelled different than it had an hour ago. She recognized that smell. She'd grown up near the mountains. That was the smell of a storm deciding to arrive early. She moved faster. The clearing was empty. Abigail stopped at the tree line and stared. Not just empty of people, so empty of everything. The fire pit was scattered, its coals spread and kicked cold, snow already beginning to reclaim the dark circle of ash. The wagon ruts in the snow led north, toward the pass, and they were not fresh. The horses had broken into a trot at some point. She could see it in the spacing of the hoofprints. They had not waited. She stood very still for a long moment. The bundle of wood was still on her shoulders. She didn't drop it. Some instinct, some older, quieter part of her, wouldn't let her drop it yet. They must have been worried about the weather, she thought. They moved up the trail and they're waiting at the pass entrance. She followed the tracks. For 20 minutes, she walked as fast as her hip would allow, following the wagon ruts north through the thinning trees toward the rocky approach of the Harrow Pass. The wind came in harder now, beginning to drive snow sideways. Her breath came in short, labored pulls. The bundle dragged at her spine and shoulders, but she didn't put it down. She didn't put it down because she was afraid of what it would mean if she did. The pass entrance was a narrow channel between two massive granite faces, maybe 15 feet wide at its broadest point. She could see the wagon tracks going through it without hesitation. Not slowing, not stopping. She stood in the entrance and looked ahead into the gray throat of the mountain, and she finally understood. There was no one waiting. They hadn't moved ahead to wait at a safe point. They hadn't sent someone back to walk with her. The tracks were hours old. They had packed up camp while she was deep in the trees, hitched the horses, and gone. They had left her. The wood bundle dropped from her shoulders into the snow. Abigail stood in the howling entrance of the Harrow Pass and felt something move through her that she didn't have a name for. Not grief, not yet. Not rage, though that was there too, banked low and hot beneath everything else. What she felt in that first long moment was something closer to clarity, a sudden, terrible understanding of something she had perhaps always known, but refused to look at directly. She was, to her family, a liability. She always had been. Her size. She had always been a large woman, broad-shouldered and full-figured in a way that her mother called unfortunate, and her brothers called other things when they thought she couldn't hear, had been a source of constant friction on the trail. The weight limits on the wagon had been cited often. Her hip had been cited more often. She slowed the group. She ate her share of the food. She required accommodation that no one else required. She had known all of this. She had tried, in her quiet, thorough way, to compensate, working harder, eating less, asking for nothing. She had convinced herself that it was enough. It hadn't been enough. It had never been enough. And now she was standing alone in a mountain pass with a blizzard 20 minutes away, wearing a coat that wasn't warm enough for this temperature, carrying a flint, a hunting knife, and nothing else. She pressed her hand flat against the cold granite face of the pass wall and breathed. Think, she told herself. Think right now and don't stop thinking. She couldn't follow them through the pass, even if she could cover the distance, and with her hip in its current state, in this weather, she could not. By the time she emerged on the other side, the storm would have buried the trail and there would be no guarantee of finding shelter or the wagon. The family had made their calculation. They were not coming back. She turned around and looked at the forest behind her. The forest was the only option, which meant survival, which meant shelter, fire, water, food, in roughly that order of urgency. She picked up 3 of the largest pieces of wood from the bundle she'd dropped, tucked them under her arm, and started walking back into the trees. The first hour was the hardest she had ever lived through. The storm came in fully within 30 minutes of her turning back, dropping visibility to near zero and driving the temperature down so fast she could feel it happening. A sudden, predatory cold that moved through fabric like it wasn't there. She needed to find shelter before her hands stopped working. Frostbitten fingers couldn't strike a flint. She moved through the trees by feel as much as sight, pressing deeper into the forest where the canopy was thicker and the wind couldn't reach the ground as effectively. She was looking for something specific: a deadfall, an overhang, a dense stand of spruce trees with their boughs hanging low, anything that could interrupt the wind and give her enough of a microclimate to get a fire going. She found it almost by accident, a massive spruce that had fallen against the slope of a ridge, its root ball pulled free of the earth and leaving a low, sheltered hollow beneath the upturned roots. The space was small, barely large enough to sit upright in, but the roots above her blocked the wind almost completely, and the dense mat of old needles on the ground was dry enough to use. She arranged the 3 pieces of wood she'd carried from the bundle, pulled dead needles and bark fiber from the walls of the hollow for tinder, and positioned the flint and her knife. Her hands were shaking, not from cold alone, from adrenaline, from hunger, from the grinding effort of the past 2 hours. She made herself slow down, struck the flint once, twice, 3 times. The sparks jumped but didn't catch. She adjusted the tinder pile, curled her body more completely around the space to block even the marginal wind that still reached her. On the 6th strike, a spark caught. She bent over it like it was the most precious thing in the world, because in that moment it was, and breathed into it with the slow, controlled exhale she'd been taught by her grandfather when she was a girl. The ember spread. A thread of smoke rose, and then, with a small and absolutely beautiful sound, the tinder caught flame. Abigail pressed her forehead against her knees and allowed herself 10 seconds. Just 10. To feel the fear moving through her, to acknowledge it, and then to set it aside. 10 seconds, her grandfather had told her once, is all you get for despair. After that, you owe it to yourself to try. She counted to 10. Then she lifted her head and got to work. Survival, she quickly learned, was less about any single dramatic moment and more about an endless series of small, deliberate decisions made under conditions that punished hesitation and rewarded efficiency. She spent the first day building up her shelter properly, dragging additional branches to reinforce the windbreak, packing snow against the outer sides to insulate it, gathering a fuel supply large enough to last through the night. Her hip made every trip for wood an exercise in managed pain, but she developed a rhythm. Gather from the nearest sources first, then expand the radius. Don't carry more than you can handle quickly. Prioritize dead, dry wood over green. She kept the fire burning small and clean, feeding it with careful precision, because a fire too large would burn through her supply before morning. She melted snow in her cupped hands for water, drinking as much as she could manage, knowing that dehydration in cold weather was sneaky and deadly. Food was the problem she couldn't solve that first day. She had nothing, not a scrap. She'd left her bowl of untouched porridge sitting beside the fire pit when she'd gone to gather wood. The irony of that was not lost on her, that her family had let her leave without even pressing her to eat first. Had they known, even then, what they were planning? Had her mother watched her walk into the trees and thought, she won't need the food? She pushed that thought away. Anger was a fuel, but an inefficient one. She needed clear thinking more than she needed righteous fury. She found wild rose hips on a frozen shrub near the edge of a small stream, shriveled and hard, but still carrying nutrition. She ate them carefully, counting them out, saving half for morning. The stream itself was mostly frozen, but she found open water at a bend where the current ran faster, and she drank until the hollow feeling in her stomach was at least partially replaced by something else. That night she huddled in her shelter with the fire at her feet and listened to the blizzard rage through the forest above her, and she thought about what came next. She could not survive indefinitely on rose hips and meltwater. She needed protein. She needed to set snares. She didn't have wire or cordage. Her knife could cut strips from the hem of her extra underskirt, which she could twist into a basic cordage. But she'd need to find game trails first, and she'd need to move carefully enough not to scare off whatever animals were using them. She also needed to consider the larger question, where was she going? The pass was closed, or would be, once the storm finished. She couldn't go forward. Going back the way the wagon had come meant days of travel through deteriorating weather with no destination she could reach in her current condition. The forest she was in pressed up against the mountain's eastern face, and she had no map. What she did have was a mountain, and mountains, her grandfather had once told her, always gave you one thing even when they gave you nothing else. High ground lets you see. Tomorrow, if the storm broke, she would climb. The storm broke on the second morning. She knew it before she opened her eyes. The quality of the silence changed, went from the muffled, pressurized quiet of a blizzard to something cleaner and colder. She uncurled herself from the position she'd slept in, knees pulled up, coat wrapped tight, fire burned to coals that she'd nursed back with her first conscious breaths, and crawled out of the shelter into a world that had been repainted overnight. The snow was deep, knee-deep in the open areas, thigh-deep in the drifts. The sky above the tree line was a blue so clear and hard it looked like something you could break a stone against. The cold was fierce, far worse than the day before, the kind of cold that came in the wake of a big storm and carried with it the serious, business-like intention of winter at full strength. She ate the remaining rose hips, drank from the stream, and assessed her hip. Bad. Not catastrophically bad. She'd felt it worse, but the night on the cold ground had stiffened the joint past the usual morning threshold, and it took her nearly 20 minutes of careful movement before the grinding settled into a manageable ache rather than an acute one. She used a long branch as a staff, which helped. Then she climbed. She moved parallel to the pass, not toward it. The pass was closed. There was no point in going near it. But east and upward, toward a rocky prominence she'd spotted through the trees the previous afternoon. It took her the better part of 2 hours to reach it, post-holing through the deep snow with her staff, stopping when the hip demanded it, moving on when she could. The view from the top made the climb worth every step. Below her and to the west, the mountain forest spread out in a white and dark green sweep that was genuinely beautiful, the kind of beautiful that doesn't care at all whether you're alive to appreciate it. To the north, the teeth of the Harrow Pass jutted against the sky. To the south, the trail they'd come up wound away through the valley, invisible under snow. And to the east, half a mile, maybe less, tucked into the fold of a lower ridge where the trees thinned and then gave way to a cleared space, was a column of smoke. Thin and gray, rising straight up in the windless cold of the post-storm morning. Someone was out there. Someone with a fire. Someone alive. Abigail stood on her rocky prominence in the brutal cold of the Blackridge Mountains and looked at that thin column of smoke for a long moment. Every reasonable thought she had said, that smoke is your only chance, every instinct honed by 3 years of life in a family that had just abandoned her said, people cannot be trusted. She looked at the smoke. She looked at the empty white forest between her and it. She thought about the rose hips she'd just finished, about the way her hip felt, about the temperature and the length of the day and the fact that she'd had nothing substantial to eat in 36 hours. All right, she said aloud, to no one, to the mountain, to whatever was listening. And she started down toward the smoke. She lost sight of it twice in the trees and had to stop and reorient herself, triangulating from the shape of the ridge above and the angle of the sun, low and pale, moving south in the winter sky. The snow was exhausting to move through. Every step with her left leg cost her twice what it cost her right, and by the time the trees began to thin and the cleared ground came into view, she was operating on something beyond ordinary endurance, something quieter and more stubborn. The cabin resolved itself from the landscape slowly, the way things do in a white winter. Edges first, then angles, then the full shape of it, a low, heavy structure built from dark timber, its roof loaded with 2 feet of fresh snow, a single window on the south face throwing out a rectangle of yellow light. A woodpile taller than the cabin itself stood against one wall, animal pelts on a drying rack, the tracks of heavy boots in the snow near the door. Someone was home. She was 20 yards away when the door opened. The man who stepped out was large, not merely tall, but built with a density that suggested he'd been shaped by a long time doing hard physical work in a place that had no tolerance for weakness. He was perhaps 35, though the beard and the weathering made it difficult to be certain. He wore a heavy coat and carried an axe, and he stopped dead when he saw her. They looked at each other across 20 yards of snow. "I'm not a threat," Abigail said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "I was abandoned by my travel party 2 days ago. I have a flint and a knife. I've eaten approximately 38 rose hips in the past day and a half. I'm asking for help." The man said nothing. He looked at her the way a person looks at something they aren't sure is actually there, with a narrow, assessing squint that took in her coat, her staff, the way she was holding her left side. "My family left me behind," she said. "I'm not dangerous, and I'm not asking for charity. I'll work for what I need." A long silence. The cold pressed in from all sides. Then the man stepped back and held the door open. "Come in, then," he said. His voice was rough from disuse, like a hinge that hadn't been oiled in a long time. "Before you freeze on my doorstep." Abigail crossed the remaining 20 yards with her eyes forward and her spine straight, because she had decided, somewhere in the past 2 days, that she was done letting people see her struggle unless it was absolutely unavoidable. She stepped through the door into the warmth, and the cabin closed around her like a hand. She had survived. Whatever came next, she had survived. The warmth hit her like a physical thing, not the gentle warmth of a well-kept parlor, but the dense animal warmth of a space that had been heated by necessity for a very long time, soaked into the timber walls and the packed earth floor until the cabin itself seemed to radiate it. Abigail stood just inside the door and felt her body respond to it involuntarily. Muscles she hadn't realized were locked solid beginning to unknot all at once, a trembling moving through her legs that she couldn't stop and didn't try to. The man, she didn't know his name yet, had already moved to the far side of the single room, setting his axe against the wall and turning to look at her with that same narrow, measuring expression he'd worn outside. He didn't offer his hand. He didn't gesture to a chair. He simply stood and watched while she took in the space. It was spare to the point of austerity. A stone fireplace dominated the north wall, burning a fire that was serious and functional rather than generous, built for heat efficiency, she noted, not for comfort. A plank table, 2 chairs of unequal height, a sleeping platform against the east wall with a single wool blanket folded across it, iron hooks along one wall holding coats, a leather pack, coils of rope and wire, shelves above the fireplace holding perhaps a dozen tins and sealed clay jars, a small stack of books on the floor beside the sleeping platform. The only thing in the room that suggested the man living here had any interior life beyond the purely practical. "Sit," he said, nodding at the taller of the 2 chairs. "Before your legs go." She sat. The chair was solid beneath her, and she was grateful for it in a way that was almost embarrassing. He pulled a tin pot from the shelf, packed it with snow from a bucket near the door, and set it on the iron grate above the fire without asking her anything further. His movements were economical in the way of someone who has lived alone long enough that every action has been stripped of all unnecessary components. "How long were you out?" he asked, not looking at her. 2 nights, 2 full days. He glanced at her over his shoulder at that. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite surprise, but a recalibration of whatever assessment he'd been making. "What did you eat?" "Rose hips, water from the creek east of the pass approach." He turned back to the fire. "You found the bend in the creek?" "Where the current keeps it open." "Yes." A pause. "Most people don't think to look for that." "Most people," Abigail said quietly, "haven't had 2 days to think about nothing else." He didn't respond to that. The snow in the pot began to melt. He added dried meat from one of the tins, dark strips of something she couldn't identify, and a handful of what looked like dried mushrooms, and after a moment he added a pinch of something from a small cloth pouch. The smell that rose was plain but deeply savory, and Abigail's stomach responded with an urgency that she hoped wasn't audible. When he handed her the cup, she wrapped both hands around it and made herself drink slowly. The broth was thin but rich with something, mineral and warming. She felt it moving through her with almost immediate effect, the way food finds you when you've been without it long enough. The man sat in the shorter chair across the table and watched her drink with the patient, evaluative stillness of someone accustomed to reading conditions rather than people. "Silas Granger," he said finally. She looked up. "Abigail Rowan." Another silence. She was beginning to understand his natural medium. "Your family," he said. "They went through the pass." "Yes?" Deliberately. It wasn't a question. She answered it anyway. "Yes." He looked at her for a moment longer, then looked at the fire. "Storm's going to hold the pass closed for 3, maybe 4 weeks. The next clearing won't come until mid-December at the earliest." She understood what he was telling her. She was here for the duration. There was nowhere else to go. I meant what I said outside, she told him. I'll work. I'm not asking for anything I won't earn. Silas Granger looked at her with an expression that was difficult to read. Not unkind, but deeply skeptical in a way that had nothing to do with her specifically and everything to do with people in general. We'll see, he said. And that was the end of the conversation for the evening. She slept on the floor near the fire, wrapped in her coat with a folded canvas he produced from a chest without comment. She slept away the profoundly exhausted sleep, without dreaming, without moving, dropping into unconsciousness as cleanly as a stone into water, and surfacing only when the cold of early morning began to creep in from the door. Silas was already gone. The fire had been banked but not extinguished. On the table were 2 strips of the dried meat and a cup of water. She sat up slowly, assessed her hip, sore, stiff, but functional, ate the meat with methodical care, and looked around the cabin in the gray morning light with new eyes. What she saw was a place that was surviving but not thriving. Functional, yes. Silas clearly knew what he was doing in the wilderness, and the evidence of his competence was everywhere, from the quality of the woodpile to the arrangement of his trapping supplies. But surviving and thriving were different things, and the difference, she'd always believed, was mostly a matter of attention to detail. The single wool blanket on his sleeping platform was frayed to the point of near uselessness along one edge where the stitching had given way. The tins on the shelf were arranged without system. She'd have to take them down one by one to know what was in each. The fireplace had a draft problem she'd noticed the night before, a faint backdraft when the wind came from the north that stole heat and pushed smoke into the room. The floor near the door was permanently damp from snow being tracked in, which meant the cold came in from below as well as through the walls. None of these things were emergencies. All of them were inefficiencies. An inefficiency in winter, she knew, was how people ran out of things, food, warmth, energy, before they expected to. She found the mending kit, a small tin with needles and thread, on the 3rd shelf she checked. She took down his blanket and began repairing the fraying edge with the tight, even stitches her grandmother had taught her. It was something to do while she thought. It was also, she understood, a small way of establishing what she'd promised him, that she would not be a passenger in this place. Silas came back at midday carrying 2 rabbits and a look of mild surprise when he saw the blanket stretched across his table with half the fraying edge already mended. He said nothing about it. He hung the rabbits on the exterior hook, came inside, poured himself water, and sat at the table watching her work for a moment. Draft from the north, she said without looking up. Your firebox needs the baffle adjusted. There's a gap on the left side where the mortar's cracked. I can see it from here. If you have lime and ash, I can mix a patch. He was quiet for a moment. There's lime in the small crock on the bottom shelf, behind the salt. She finished the row of stitches and looked up. Thank you. He looked at her for a moment longer than was comfortable, then looked away. I'll skin the rabbits, he said. You can do what you want with them after. What she did with them was stretch them considerably further than he expected. She found wild onion beneath the snow along the south side of the cabin. She'd spotted the dried stems poking through while she'd been gathering snow for water, and dug up enough bulbs to flavor the pot. She rationed the dried mushrooms he had on the shelf, using half what she might have used otherwise, knowing instinctively that supply management was as important as cooking. She made a broth from the bones before they were discarded, reducing it down to a dark, concentrated liquid she sealed in a clean tin for the next day. From the remaining meat she made 2 portions, giving Silas the larger one without comment. He ate in silence, in his usual way. But she noticed he ate the entire bowl without setting any aside, which told her something about the quality of what he'd been eating before she arrived. When he finished, he sat for a moment looking at the fire. Then he said without turning, "That's the best meal I've had in about 8 months." It was not a compliment delivered easily, from a man who did not deliver compliments easily. Abigail felt something warm move through her that had nothing to do with the fire. "The onions helped," she said simply. "I've been walking past those onions for 3 winters," he said. "Didn't know they were there." The days built on each other slowly, the way trust builds. Not in grand gestures, but in accumulated small ones, each one adding to the next until the structure has more weight than any individual piece. Silas left each morning before first light to check his trapline, which covered an ambitious circuit of the forest to the east and south of the cabin. He returned by mid-afternoon, processed whatever he'd caught, and spent the remaining daylight on the endless maintenance work that a winter cabin required. splitting and stacking wood, checking the roof for ice buildup, tending the horses. He had one, a sturdy dark mare named Colt, which Abigail found deeply amusing and did not comment on, and preparing his equipment for the next day. He was a man who had built his life around efficiency and solitude, and the two things had reinforced each other until they were practically indistinguishable. He didn't waste words because he had no one to waste them on. He didn't maintain comforts because there had been no one to share them with. The cabin was functional the way a tool is functional, designed for a single purpose, stripped of anything that didn't serve that purpose directly. Abigail worked on everything he didn't. She repaired the baffle in the firebox with a lime and ash mixture that dried hard overnight, and the difference in the cabin's warmth the following day was immediate and measurable. Silas noticed it, she could see, though he didn't say anything until the third day, when he finally remarked in his oblique way, "Room holds heat better." "The baffle," she confirmed. She reorganized the supply shelf by category and frequency of use, marking the tins with small symbols scratched into the lids with the tip of her knife so they could be identified at a glance. She found that 2 of the tins she'd assumed were food were actually duplicates of equipment, extra flints and a spare striker, and relocated them to the tool section of the shelf, freeing up food space and clarifying what their actual provisions looked like. What they looked like was enough, if managed carefully. Not comfortable, but enough. The trap line, under Silas's experienced management, produced a steady if modest supply of rabbit, squirrel, and occasionally something larger. The preserved supplies on the shelf would stretch, she estimated, to late February if she was deliberate about them. The real gap was variety. The nutritional monotony of a winter diet in the mountains was its own quiet danger, the thing that wore people down not through starvation, but through the slow depletion of things the body needed that dried meat and stored grain couldn't fully supply. She addressed this the way she addressed every problem, practically, incrementally, without drama. She found pine needles and made a tea from them that she pressed on Silas every morning with a firmness that clearly surprised him, given that no one had pressed anything on him in a very long time. "It prevents the winter sickness," she explained, the first time he looked at it with the expression of a man being asked to do something he found undignified. "The needles have something in them. My grandfather swore by it. He drank it. He didn't complain, which she was learning was as close to agreement as Silas Granger typically got. She found dried yarrow in one of the unmarked tins, apparently gathered and then forgotten, and added it to the medical store she was quietly assembling from what the cabin already contained. She noted the honey tin, the sulfur, the clean linen strips she found in the bottom of the equipment chest. She didn't say anything about her medical organization to Silas. She simply did it, the way she did most things, quietly, thoroughly, without asking for acknowledgement. But she cataloged it all in her mind, because this was a dangerous place, and dangerous places had a way of making use of everything you'd prepared for, eventually. The first real conversation happened on the 11th day. It came without warning, the way real conversations often do. Not in the moments designated for them, but sideways, out of a silence that had been building long enough to need releasing. Silas had come in earlier than usual, empty-handed. The northern section of the trap line had yielded nothing, which was unusual and meant the animal patterns were shifting, possibly driven by a new predator in that area. He sat at the table with the weight of a man doing arithmetic in his head that he didn't like the answers to, and Abigail, who was mending one of his coats where the left sleeve had separated at the shoulder seam, watched him without appearing to. "How long have you been out here?" she asked, finally. He looked up, seemed to consider whether to answer. 11 years. She'd estimated 10, and felt a small private satisfaction at being close. "Alone the whole time?" "Mostly." A pause. "Had a partner the first 2 years. He went back to Missouri when his mother took sick. Never came back." "Did you want to go back with him?" Silas looked at her with an expression that was the closest thing to surprise she'd seen on him. "No," he said. "I didn't." She returned to the coat. "What made you stay?" The silence stretched long enough that she thought he'd decided not to answer. Then, "Out here, things are what they are. Storm is a storm, cold is cold. Animals hungry or it's not." He paused again, and she had the impression he was saying things he'd thought many times but never said aloud. "People back east, they say one thing and do another. smile at you, and mean something else entirely. Out here, there's no room for that. Things are honest. Abigail kept her eyes on her stitching. People aren't always dishonest, she said carefully. In my experience, your experience is a sample of one man in one place over 11 years, she said, without heat, without apology. Mine is different, but I'll grant you that dishonesty is, she chose the word carefully, common enough to plan around. He looked at her for a moment. Something in his expression had shifted slightly, the way a door shifts when someone tries the handle from the other side, not opening, but acknowledging the pressure. Your family, he said. It wasn't a question, but it was an invitation. She set the coat down. My father decided I was a burden the day I injured my hip. My mother agreed with him as she agreed with everything he said. My brothers didn't disagree because disagreeing with my father cost more than it was worth to them. She kept her voice level. They're not monsters. They're people who made a calculation and decided I didn't add up to enough. And that doesn't... Silas stopped. Make me angry? She picked the coat back up. Oh, it does. Quite a lot, actually. But anger is expensive out here, and I can't afford it. He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the wind moved through the trees with a sound like breathing. You're not what I expected, he said finally. When I saw you coming across the snow. What did you expect? He seemed to think about it honestly. Someone broken, he said. 3 days alone in those conditions, with that leg. I expected someone who'd given up inside, even if they were still moving. Abigail looked at him. What did you find instead? He held her gaze for a moment, then looked at the fire. Someone who was angry enough to keep moving, he said, which is different. She smiled at that. A real smile, small and private. My grandfather would have said the same thing. She learned his rhythms the way you learn the rhythms of a place you've decided to understand. Not by asking, but by paying attention. Silas was a fundamentally private man, not in the way of someone hiding something specific, but in the way of someone who had become accustomed to having no audience and therefore no performance. He thought out loud occasionally, in brief fragments, observations about animal sign, about the weather, about the structural integrity of the woodpile, and she learned to receive these fragments without expanding them into conversations he hadn't invited. In return, he learned something about her, that she could be quiet, that she didn't need the room filled, that her silences were comfortable rather than pointed, the silences of someone who was content in their own company even while sharing space with someone else. It was, she suspected, the thing that made cohabitation bearable for a man who hadn't cohabitated in 11 years. What she didn't show him, not yet, not consciously, was how much she was watching, how much she was learning about this mountain, about its rhythms and dangers and resources, from everything he did and said and didn't say. She mapped the trap line in her memory from the details he let fall. She noted which wind direction preceded snowfall and which preceded clear weather. She learned the sounds the cabin made when temperature dropped sharply in the night versus when it merely stayed cold. She memorized the location of every supply in the cabin, every tool, every piece of medical material she'd quietly organized. Not because she was planning anything, not yet, but because Abigail Rowan had spent 3 days alone in a blizzard on a mountain that had tried to kill her, and she had learned something about preparation that she suspected she would carry for the rest of her life. You stored knowledge the same way you stored firewood, not because you needed it right this moment, but because winter was long and the moment you needed it, you would need it completely. The fire burned, the snow fell outside and kept falling. The days shortened toward the deep of winter. And in the spare, austere cabin on the eastern face of the Black Ridge Mountains, two people who had both been abandoned in their own ways, one by family, one by faith in his fellow man, learned, slowly and with great caution, the difficult and necessary art of trusting someone who was still, in so many ways, a stranger. The storm that changed everything came in the 3rd week of December, without the usual warning signs Silas had taught her to read. There had been no shift in the wind direction the evening before. No particular heaviness in the air, no behavioral change in the animals near the cabin, none of the signals that had preceded every previous storm since Abigail had arrived. It came from the northwest instead of the north, which Silas said later was the only kind of storm in the Black Ridge Range that moved faster than a man could predict, a particular collision of cold air masses that the mountain funneled and amplified into something that bore no resemblance to ordinary winter weather. It came in the early afternoon while Silas was on the far end of the eastern trap line, the section that curved around the base of a granite shoulder a mile and a half from the cabin. Abigail was inside when she heard the sound. Not wind, not yet, but the pressure change that preceded it. A brief and total silence that fell over the forest like a hand pressed over a mouth. She'd learned to trust that silence. She stood from the table where she'd been working on an inventory of their food stores, went to the window and looked out at a sky that had turned the color of a bruise in the space of minutes. She put on her coat, gathered an armful of wood from the interior stack, and stoked the fire to its maximum capacity. She pulled water from the snow bucket and set the full pot to heat. She checked the medical tin. Her organized medical tin, needles and thread and honey and clean linen, and the small bottle of spirits Silas kept on the bottom shelf, which he had never once touched in the 3 weeks she'd been here. She did all of this quickly and methodically, and then she went to the door and opened it and looked out at the northwestern tree line where the storm was coming from, and felt the first true fear of the evening move through her. Because Silas was not back yet, and the storm was going to arrive in less than 30 minutes. She waited as long as she dared, but 10 minutes, watching the sky collapse toward the tree line, feeling the temperature drop in increments that were almost visible. Then she pulled her coat tight, picked up the long staff she used for her hip, and walked to the edge of the cleared ground around the cabin, where the tree line began. She did not go further. She knew she couldn't. The eastern trap line was 1.5 miles away, and in the time it would take her to reach even the halfway point, the storm would have her in its teeth in open forest with no shelter. Going after him would mean 2 people lost instead of 1. So she stood at the tree line in the last minutes before the storm arrived and she called his name. 3 times, as loud as she could manage, the sound swallowed almost immediately by the rushing air that preceded the wind. Then she went back inside because there was nothing else to do, and she waited. He came through the door 40 minutes into the storm. She heard him before she saw him, a heavy, irregular impact against the door, not a knock, but a body weight pressed against it, and she was across the room before the thought had fully formed. She pulled the door open against the wind, and Silas Granger half fell through it, and she caught as much of his weight as she could with both arms and her staff braced against the floor. He was conscious. That was the first thing she registered. He was conscious, and he was moving, and he was trying to say something, which meant his brain was functioning. The second thing she registered was the blood. It had soaked through his right trouser leg from mid-thigh downward, dark and heavy in the way that meant it had been bleeding for some time rather than recently. His face was gray under the weathering and the cold, not the gray of frostbite, but the gray of blood loss combined with prolonged exposure. A particular exhausted pallor she recognized from the one time she'd seen a man bleed badly 3 years ago, back before the trail. She got him to the sleeping platform. It took most of what she had. He was a large man, and he was barely helping, his right leg not bearing weight at all. And she was breathing hard by the time she got him seated on the edge of it, with his back against the wall. "What happened?" she said. Not a question. She was already reaching for his trouser leg, already pulling her knife to cut the fabric away from the wound because there was no way to roll it up over whatever was below. "Deadfall," he said. His voice was flat with controlled pain. Brace gave way. Whole section came down. A pause, through which she could hear him managing his breathing. Took a branch through the leg, pulled it out. She cut the fabric away and looked. The wound was bad. A puncture rather than a slash, which was in some ways worse. The branch had gone in at an angle on the outer thigh, and the hole it left was deep and ragged and had been bleeding without compression for the better part of an hour. It was not arterial. She checked that first, looking for the bright pulsing red that would have meant he had minutes rather than hours. But it was serious, and it was dirty, and left untreated through the night, she knew without having to reason it through, it would become infected. In these temperatures, in this isolation, infection here was a death sentence. "I need to clean this," she said. She was pulling the medical tin from the shelf before she'd finished the sentence. "And stitch it. I've done it before, on a horse, not a person, but the principle is the same. I'm telling you now so you can argue with me before I start rather than during." Silas looked at her from the sleeping platform. His jaw was tight, and his eyes were very focused in the way of someone directing all available resources toward a single task, which in his case was not bleeding to death. "How many times?" he said. "On the horse?" "Once. Successfully." She found the needle and thread. She found the spirits. You have a better option. I'm listening. He was quiet for a moment. No, he said. Go ahead. This is going to hurt a great deal, she said. I won't pretend otherwise. I know. Can you stay still? He looked at her steadily. Yes. She believed him. She put the spirits on the wound first, which produced a sound from Silas that was not quite a word and not quite a groan, but something between the two that she filed away and did not comment on. She cleaned it as thoroughly as she could with the clean linen, removing debris she didn't want to look at too carefully. Then she threaded the needle with hands that she made stop shaking through an act of will she didn't know she had, and she began. He kept his word. He stayed still through the entire thing. 7 stitches, each one extracted from her with the concentration of a woman performing surgery in a mountain cabin in a blizzard by firelight, which was exactly what she was doing. She could feel the tremble in her hands trying to assert itself, and she refused it. She counted the stitches as she set them. She talked while she worked, not about the wound, not about the pain, but about small things. The inventory she'd been doing before the storm, the adjustment she'd been planning for the eastern section of the supply shelf, the question of whether the yarrow tea worked better with or without the pine needle addition. It was not conversation. It was rhythm. It was something to fill the space between the stitches. When she tied off the last one and pressed clean linen over the wound and bound it tight, she sat back on her heels and allowed herself one long exhale. Silas was pale. Paler than she'd seen him and very still, but his eyes were open and tracking. You did 7, he said. 7, she confirmed. Your hands didn't shake. She looked at her hands. They were shaking now, quite badly. She folded them in her lap. They waited, she said. Something moved across his face, past the pain and the exhaustion, something she didn't have a name for yet. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, then he said quietly, Thank you, Abigail. It was the first time he'd used her name. She stood up, because if she stayed on her heels any longer, she was going to feel something she didn't have the capacity to feel right now. She had work to do. Sleep if you can, she said. I'll wake you every 2 hours through the night. Fever comes fast with a wound like that, and I need to know early if it starts. He didn't argue. He closed his eyes, and within 10 minutes his breathing had shifted into the heavy, effortful sleep of someone whose body was engaged in emergency repair. Abigail sat in the shorter chair by the fire and listened to the blizzard dismantle the world outside and thought about what tomorrow was going to require of her. The fever came at midnight, right on schedule, as though infection had a timetable it kept to regardless of inconvenience. She'd woken him twice already for the 2-hour checks. His temperature elevated, but manageable the first time, elevated further the second. By midnight it had crossed the line from concerning into dangerous. His skin throwing off heat she could feel before she'd fully crossed the room, his breathing fast and shallow in a way that made her jaw tighten. She got water into him by degrees, tipping small amounts between his lips every 20 minutes, because she knew dehydration would accelerate everything she was trying to prevent. She put the remaining yarrow into a tea and added willow bark from the small supply she'd found in an unmarked tin 2 weeks ago and quietly saved without being certain she'd ever need it. Willow bark for the fever. Yarrow to support the blood. Honey on the wound dressing, which she'd read about years ago in one of her grandfather's medical books and had never forgotten because it had seemed improbable enough to stick in the mind. She did not sleep. She sat with him through the long machinery of that night, checking his wound for the red lines that would mean the infection was spreading into the blood, monitoring his temperature with the back of her hand against his forehead, keeping the fire steady at a temperature that would warm the room without overheating a man already burning from inside. Sometime in the dark hours before dawn, he surfaced briefly from the fever, not fully conscious, but aware enough to know where he was. Still here, he said. Unclear whether it was a question or a statement. Still here, she said. He didn't say anything else, but she saw his hand lying at his side on the sleeping platform, close briefly into a loose fist and then relax, like a man reassuring himself of solid ground. She tended the fire and waited for morning. The fever broke on the second day. She knew it by the change in his breathing first, slower, deeper, losing the feverish rapidity, and then by the sweat that soaked through the wool blanket she'd tucked around him. She changed the dressing on the wound, and what she found there was against every anxiety she'd carried through the past 36 hours. Clean. The stitches were holding. The edges of the wound were drawing together without the red-hot swelling of infection taking root. She let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding since the moment he'd fallen through the door. Silas opened his eyes in the early afternoon of the second day and looked at the ceiling with the focused, orienting expression of a man taking inventory of himself. "How bad?" he said. "You had a significant fever for about 30 hours, she told him. "It broke this morning. The wound is clean. You'll need to stay off that leg for at least a week. The stitches will hold if you're careful, but they won't hold if you're not." He absorbed this with the expression of a man to whom a week of inactivity was a form of punishment. "The trap line? I'll check it," she said. He looked at her. "Your hip? We'll manage." She didn't say it harshly. She said it the way she said most things. As a fact, established, not open for extended discussion. "Tell me the route. I've memorized most of it from what you've described, but I need the section near the granite shoulder specifically. That's where you said the deadfall was." He studied her face for a long moment. She could see him making a calculation that had nothing to do with mathematics. "You've never run a trap line," he said. "I've never stitched a human being before either," she said. "And yet—" Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. Silas Granger didn't deploy smiles casually, but the nearest thing to one she'd seen. "The northern section first," he said. "Follow the creek until you find the split pine. You'll recognize it. It's the only one in that stretch. Turn east from there. The first 3 sets are within 50 yards of each other." She sat down and listened with complete attention, committing every detail to memory, asking precise questions about landmarks and distances and the specific mechanism of the trap releases. He answered them with equal precision, the two of them working through the route with the focused efficiency of people who understood that competence in this situation was not optional. When they'd finished, he was quiet for a moment. "There's something else," he said. His voice was careful. "The reason the northern section came up empty before the storm." She waited. "I found sign," he said. "A lot of it, pack sign. Moving in a pattern I've seen before. They're circling, ranging out to find the boundaries of their territory and coming back." He paused. "Wolves." The word settled into the room with the weight of something that had been there already, unnamed. "How many?" "From the sign. 7. Maybe 8. He met her eyes. "They're hungry, Abigail. A pack that size, in this part of the winter, this far down from the high ground. They came down because there's nothing left up there. They're going to find this cabin." She thought about this. About Colt and the small stable attached to the cabin's north wall. About their food supply, which she'd calculated in her meticulous way to be adequate but not abundant. About the fact that Silas could not walk, would not be able to walk properly for a week at minimum, and that she was the only mobile person in a cabin that a hungry wolf pack was going to find eventually. She thought about all of this with the same methodical clarity she'd brought to every problem since the night her family's wagon tracks disappeared into the snow. "All right," she said. She stood up and began moving toward her coat. "I'll check the eastern line first. Shorter circuit, better return. And while I'm out there, I'll look at the ground around the northern section. If they're ranging in a pattern, the pattern will be readable." Silas watched her pull on her coat. "You're thinking about something," he said. "I'm thinking about several things," she said. She pulled the cord tight and picked up her staff and her knife. "The most interesting one is that a pack circling to find the boundaries of their territory will come from a predictable direction and stop at the boundaries they've already established." She looked at him. "Which means if you know where those boundaries are, you know where they're going to be." Silas was quiet for a moment. "You're thinking about using the trap line against them." "I'm thinking," she said carefully, "that 7 hungry wolves coming at a cabin from an established angle on a predictable schedule are 7 problems that can be managed if you don't wait for them to arrive on their own terms." He looked at her with that expression she was coming to know, the one that recalibrated itself slightly every time she said something he hadn't anticipated. "Be careful on the granite shoulder," he said finally. "The deadfall section is unstable. Go around the south side." She nodded. "I'll be back before dark." "Abigail!" His voice stopped her at the door. She turned. He was looking at her from the sleeping platform with an expression she couldn't fully parse. Something between concern and something older, something that had been a long time gathering. The wolves. If you see the pack, you come back. You don't engage. Not alone. She looked at him for a moment. I know, she said. She went out into the cold, pulling the door closed behind her, and stood for a moment in the sharp winter air listening to the silence of the forest. The storm had passed. The snow was deep and clean, and the sky was the hard, pale blue of deep winter. And somewhere in the trees to the north, 8 hungry wolves were tracing the boundaries of a territory that included one small cabin and everything in it. Her hip ached. Her body was tired in ways that had become so familiar they almost didn't register anymore. She had slept perhaps 6 hours in the past 2 days, eaten less than she should have, spent the better part of 2 nights watching a man's fever with the focused attention of someone who understood that the line between sufficient and insufficient care in a situation like this was very thin. She adjusted her grip on her staff and started north along the tree line, her tracks the only marks in the unbroken white. The forest received her in its usual silence. She moved through it with the careful, unhurried efficiency she had developed over the past 3 weeks. Not fast, because fast wasn't possible with her hip on terrain like this, but steady and attentive, reading the ground the way Silas had been teaching her to read it without meaning to, through everything he'd let fall in conversation and through her own accumulated observation. She found wolf sign within 100 yards of the northern trap line. Fresh tracks in the snow, large, deep-pressed, the overlapping patterns of a pack moving in loose formation. She crouched over them, ignoring the protest of her hip, and studied the direction of travel. They'd come down from the northwest, moved southeast along the line of the trees, and turned back at a point that corresponded almost exactly with what Silas had described. They were mapping the boundary. She stood and looked north along the tree line and thought about angles and distances, and the way a hungry animal's behavior became predictable precisely because hunger narrowed options. Then she began, carefully, methodically, to form a plan. Not a plan born from desperation or fear, though both of those were present, and she was honest enough to acknowledge them. A plan born from the same thing that had gotten her out of a blizzard with a flint and 38 rose hips. The understanding that in any situation where the variables were against you, the only thing you could control was how you used the ones that weren't. The wolves had hunger and numbers and darkness on their side. They had pattern. They had the assumption that the thing in the cabin was waiting for them. She had time, barely. She had knowledge of the terrain. She had a trap line and a man who had taught her, without intending to, everything she needed to know about how animals moved through this particular forest. And she had the one advantage that hunger always gave away without meaning to, predictability. She turned and walked back toward the cabin, her staff marking a steady rhythm in the snow, her mind running clean and fast through the structure of what she was building. The wolves were coming. She knew that now with the certainty of something red in the ground rather than merely feared. The only question was whether they arrived on their terms or on hers. She intended, with everything she had left, to make it hers. She laid out the plan to Silas that evening by firelight, drawing it in the ash on the hearthstone with the tip of her knife, the way she'd seen her grandfather draw field layouts when he was planning something that had to go right the first time. He listened without interrupting, which she had learned was his way of indicating genuine attention rather than polite tolerance. His leg was elevated on the folded canvas, the wound dressing changed an hour ago and holding clean. The color in his face improved enough from the day before that she'd allowed herself to stop monitoring his breathing every 20 minutes and simply watch him think instead. She showed him the boundary line she'd identified from the wolf sign, the arc they'd been traveling, the points where they'd turned back, the gap in the northwestern tree line where the tracks were densest and the snow most disturbed. "They're coming from here," she said, marking the point. "They've established this as their entry corridor. They'll use it again because it worked. No threat, no resistance, good approach cover. That's the draw between the 2 ridges," Silas said. He was leaning forward despite the leg, elbows on his knees, studying the hearthstone with the focused expression of a man who understood terrain the way other men understood mathematics. "Funnels the wind south. They're scent checking the cabin from there." "Which means they already know exactly what's here," she said. "They know about Colt. They've probably smelled the stored meat. They'll come at night." "Yes, tonight or tomorrow. They've been circling for at least 3 days, based on what you said about the northern section. That's a pack that's made a decision. She set the knife down. Which means I need to move tomorrow at first light at the latest. Tonight, if the moon gives enough light to work by. Silas looked at the hearthstone layout for a long moment. Then he looked up at her. Walk me through the sequence. She did. She talked for 20 minutes, steady and precise, covering every element in the order she'd arranged them in her mind during the walk back from the northern line. The channel, the bait positioning, the trap reset locations she'd identified on the eastern section during the afternoon's check, the noise element, which was the most uncertain piece and the one she'd spent the most time thinking about. When she finished, Silas was quiet for a long moment. It'll work if the channel holds them, he said. If 2 or 3 break early and go around the south side. They won't. She said it with more certainty than she strictly had. Not if the bait is positioned right. Hungry animals don't go around. They go toward. The only thing that breaks that is a threat from directly ahead, and they won't know the threat is there until it's already operating. He looked at her steadily. You're betting both our lives on the predictability of 8 starving wolves. I'm betting both our lives on the fact that predictability is what hunger produces, she said. And on the work you've already done, the trapline isn't mine. I'm just using it differently than it was intended. Another silence. Outside, the temperature was dropping in the way it dropped on clear nights in the Black Ridge Range, fast and serious, the cold arriving with the stars like something that had been waiting for dark to move. Somewhere in the distance, deep in the trees, something howled once and did not repeat. They both heard it. All right, Silas said. His voice was quiet and very even. Tell me what you need from me. She went out at first light. The moon had been sufficient, barely, and she'd spent 2 hours of the previous night resetting 3 of the eastern traps at new locations along the boundary line she'd identified, repositioning them in the channel between the ridges where the wolf tracks were concentrated. It was the coldest work she'd ever done. Kneeling in the snow in the dark, with her hip screaming at the unnatural angles required to set the mechanisms correctly. But she'd done it by touch as much as sight, and she'd done it right. She'd checked each one twice. The bait she'd used was the hardest part. It came out of their food supply, and there was no way around that. 3 strips of the smoked meat from the tin she'd inventoried carefully enough to know they could absorb the loss. She'd positioned them at intervals along the channel, the final piece furthest in, drawing a line that a hungry pack following scent would naturally follow forward rather than around. In the gray pre-dawn light, she checked the resets, confirmed they were undisturbed, and then did the thing that was either the smartest or most dangerous component of the plan, and possibly both. She made noise, not panic noise, not random noise, deliberate directional noise designed to push the pack from where they were toward where she needed them to be. She'd explained this to Silas the night before using language he'd actually used himself in a different context. You don't chase an animal into a trap. You give it a reason to move in the direction the trap is already waiting. She worked her way south of the cabin in a wide arc, staying downwind, striking 2 pieces of wood together at intervals as she moved. Not constant, intermittent, the way a sound carries when something is moving through a forest. She was telling the pack, in the language of sound and scent and movement, that there was pressure from the south, that the corridor between the ridges was the cleaner option. She was funneling them. Her hip had been bad since she rose. The cold of the night's work and the unnatural positioning had inflamed the joint past its usual morning threshold, and she was using the staff heavily, relying on it in a way she generally tried to avoid because it slowed her, and she knew it. She moved anyway. She moved because the alternative was to let 8 wolves dictate the terms of what happened to the cabin and the man inside it who could not yet stand without his leg giving way. And that was not an alternative she was willing to accept. The forest was very still. The snow on the ground was untouched by wind, pristine in the early light, and she could read it like a page, every track, every disturbance, every place where something had moved through in the night. She followed the wolf sign with one eye as she worked, tracking the pack's overnight movements, adjusting her own path in response. They had been close. Very close. The tracks on the western side of the cabin clearing came within 40 yards of the wall before turning back, and they were fresh enough that the edges were still sharp in the cold air. Hours old, maybe less. The pack had done its final reconnaissance in the hours before dawn and made its decision. They were coming tonight, which meant she had today to finish what she'd started. She was back inside by mid-morning, cold through to the center of herself in a way that the fire took nearly an hour to address properly. Silas had managed, using the wall and a length of rope she'd rigged as a support, to move from the sleeping platform to his chair, and he was sitting at the table with his legs stretched out and his expression arranged into something carefully neutral that she recognized as the face he made when he was in more pain than he intended to show. "The line of approach," he said, when she'd gotten her coat off and her hands wrapped around a cup of the pine needle tea. "Same as I mapped," she said. "They were at the western wall before dawn. 40 yards. She paused. "They've made their choice." He absorbed this. "And the channel resets? Clean, undisturbed." She drank the tea. "If they follow the pattern, and they will, the sign is unambiguous. They'll hit the first position before they know what's happening. The sound and the disruption will push the back of the pack forward, not back. They'll compress into the channel." She set the cup down. "We need to talk about the rifle." Silas looked at her. "I can't move through the snow on this leg, not tonight." "I know," she said, "which is why I'm going to need you to be positioned at the window, and I'm going to need to trust your aim at distance in low light." He held her gaze for a moment. "My aim in low light is not the question." "I know that too," she said quietly. "The question is whether I can get them into the channel cleanly enough that you have the angle." "If you get them into the channel," he said, "the angle is there. 30 yards, maybe 35. I can work with that." She nodded. "Then we have a plan." "Abigail." His voice had something in it she didn't hear often, so something careful and deliberate, the way he spoke when he was saying something he'd thought through rather than something instinctive. "If it goes wrong out there, if the pack splits early or you can't get clear, I'll get clear," she said. "If you can't." "Silas?" She met his eyes. "I have been making decisions about how much risk my body can handle for 3 years since the day I fell off that roof and people started making those decisions for me instead." She kept her voice level and her eyes steady. "I know what I can do. I know what I can't. Trust me the same way I trusted you when I walked across that snow toward a stranger's cabin." He was quiet for a long moment. Something moved in his face, past the concern, past the calculation, into something quieter and more fundamental. "All right," he said. "I trust you." The wolves came at the 4th hour of night, in the deep cold that settled into the Black Ridge forest somewhere between midnight and 3 in the morning, when the temperature found its lowest point and everything went very still. Abigail heard them before she saw them. A soft compression in the snow, barely audible, the sound of large bodies moving with the deliberate quiet of predators who believed they were the only thing in the forest paying attention. She was positioned east of the channel, 20 yards back in the trees, pressed against the base of a spruce with her staff across her knees and her breath coming in slow, careful increments that she released downward and sideways, away from the wind. She had a torch, unlit, sitting in the snow beside her right hand, and a length of the twisted cordage she'd made weeks ago from her underskirt hem, now serving a different purpose than snares. A noisemaker, loaded with 3 tin cups from the cabin shelf. Crude, effective. She'd tested it in the afternoon. The pack came through the northwestern draw in the pattern she'd predicted. The lead animals first, moving low and fast through the compressed channel between the ridges, noses working the air. She counted shadows. 1, 2, 3, 4 in the channel itself, 2 more hanging at the edges, and she was searching for the 7th and 8th when the first wolf hit the trap. The sound it made was immediate and shocking in the night silence, a yelp that carried through the cold air like a crack in glass. And the effect on the pack was exactly what she'd anticipated and feared equally. They didn't scatter. They compressed. The rear animals pushed forward toward the sound, which was the instinct of a pack in close formation, and the front animals turned back on themselves in the channel, and for a period of approximately 4 seconds, everything she'd planned existed in perfect suspension. She lit the torch in one motion. The flint was already positioned. She'd practiced it 20 times in the afternoon, and threw the cordage and tin cups contraption in a high arc over the pack's position, and the sound it made when it landed was extraordinary. A sudden cacophony of rattling metal that hit the wolves from above and behind simultaneously with the appearance of fire to their front. They broke, but they broke forward, which was what she needed. out of the channel and into the cleared ground on the western approach, moving fast, and through the trees she could see the cabin window and the dark shape of Silas positioned there with the rifle. The first shot came clean and sure in the darkness. Then the second. She was moving laterally, staying in the trees, keeping her torch high and visible to give him the edge of light he needed to work with. The pack was in full motion now, not the coordinated hunting movement of animals in control, but the fractured reactive movement of animals that had encountered something they didn't understand from a direction they hadn't prepared for. The third shot. A pause. She counted his reload time, knew it to the second, then the fourth. 2 wolves had broken back through the draw to the north. She let them go. Running animals were not the threat. Only the ones still moving toward the cabin mattered, and by the time the 5th shot came, the dynamics in the clearing had shifted completely. The pack broke north. All remaining animals, running, vanishing into the darkness of the forest above the cabin with a speed that was almost beautiful to watch. Pure survival reflex, every ounce of predatory intention abandoned in favor of the older, deeper imperative. Silence fell over the clearing. Abigail stood in the trees with her torch burning low and her heart hitting her ribs with a force she could feel in her throat, and she counted. She counted the shapes on the ground in the clearing. She counted the tracks disappearing north. She counted her own breaths until they came down from their panicked pitch to something manageable. Then she walked out of the trees. Silas had the window open despite the cold and was leaning through it with the rifle still in his hands, scanning the clearing. He found her immediately. She was the one with the torch, and she watched the tension in his shoulders release in a single, visible movement. "Clear," she said. Her voice came out steady. She was surprised by that. "Clear," he confirmed. "All of them are accounted for." She stood in the middle of the clearing in the deep cold of the Blackridge night and looked at the evidence of what had just happened. The tracks, the disruption in the snow, the proof that a plan built in a single afternoon from desperation and careful thinking and a man's second-hand knowledge of this forest had worked. And she felt something move through her that was not triumph exactly, but was adjacent to it. Something more lasting than triumph. The specific satisfaction of a thing done correctly under conditions that did not allow for second attempts. She was still standing there when she heard the cabin door open, and she turned to find Silas in the doorway, his weight on his good leg, the door frame taking the rest. "Get inside," he said. "You'll freeze." She looked at him for a moment. This man who had been alone for 11 years, who had opened a door for a stranger in a blizzard because, she suspected, something in him that solitude hadn't entirely extinguished, had recognized something in her. She thought about how far she had come from the tree line where she'd stood with 60 pounds of wood on her back, watching wagon tracks disappear. She thought about Rose's hips and flint strikes and the particular quality of a silence that falls over a clearing at night after something very large and very dangerous has decided to go somewhere else. "In a minute," she said. He didn't argue. He stood in the doorway and watched her stand in the clearing, and she stood there long enough to let the moment settle into her, the way warmth settles into cold timber. Slowly, completely, in a way that stays. The weeks that followed were the quietest and in some ways the most significant of Abigail Rowan's life. Silas healed with the methodical determination of a man who found convalescence personally offensive, pushing the boundary of what she would allow him to do each day with a persistence that would have been frustrating if she hadn't found it, privately and against her will, somewhat admirable. She held the line on the trapline for 12 days, running the full circuit herself, every morning, in the deepening cold of a January that settled over the Blackridge Range like a permanent condition, and released him back to half circuit on the 13th when she examined the wound and found the stitches had done their work cleanly, and the tissue below was sound. "You do good work," he said, looking at it himself for the first time in the clear light of a windless morning. "I had good material," she said. "You didn't move the stitches even once." "I moved them twice," he said. "When you weren't watching." She looked at him. He was looking at the wound with the studied neutrality of a man making a confession he'd rather not have witnessed. "Silas, the second night, I needed water." He paused. "And the fourth night, there was something on the roof." "A branch," she said. "I heard it too. I checked in the morning." She pulled the clean linen from the medical tin and began wrapping the wound for what she'd already decided would be the last dressing. You could have woken me. You'd been awake for 30 hours. She stopped rapping for a moment, continued. You could have woken me anyway. He was quiet in the way that meant he was acknowledging something without saying it. She finished the rapping and tied it off and didn't push further because she had learned that Silas Granger processed things in his own time, and trying to accelerate that process was like trying to accelerate weather. Theoretically possible to want, entirely pointless to attempt. What she noticed in the days that followed were the small changes, the way he began to explain the trapline to her with more detail than was strictly necessary for someone just running it for him, as though he were teaching rather than informing. The way he started asking her opinion on supply management in a way that was less consultation and more genuine inquiry, actually adjusting his practices based on what she said. The way the silences between them changed quality, became less the silences of two people coexisting carefully and more the silences of two people comfortable enough to not need to fill the air between them. She noticed these things and said nothing about them, because naming something fragile too early was how you broke it. But she thought about them in the long, quiet hours while he slept, and she maintained the fire. She thought about how strange it was that the worst thing that had ever happened to her, the morning she'd walked back from the forest with 60 pounds of wood and found an empty clearing, had brought her here, to this particular cabin, to this particular man, to this particular version of herself, the one who ran a trapline in January on a bad hip and stood in a clearing at midnight with a burning torch and held her hand steady enough to stitch a human wound because there was no one else. She thought about her family, not with the hot rage that had moved through her in the early days, that had burned down to something cooler and more permanent, the way a fire burns down to coals that hold their heat longer than the flame ever did. She thought about her father's calculations and her mother's compliance and her brother's silence, and she found that what she felt, mostly, was something close to clarity. She understood them. She did not forgive them in any simple sense, but she understood the logic, the cruel, practical frontier logic of people managing scarcity and fear. They had looked at her and seen a weight. They had been wrong, but she understood the mechanism that made them wrong. What she couldn't forgive, and didn't try to, was that they had not looked harder. On the 23rd day of January, the temperature rose for the first time in 6 weeks. Rose perceptibly, not dramatically, but enough to change the quality of the light and the texture of the snow in a way that carried information about what was eventually coming. Spring was not close, but it had become thinkable, which was its own kind of shift. Silas came back from the full trap line, his first complete circuit since the injury, which she'd cleared him for 3 days prior and monitored with the careful, unobtrusive attention she'd developed for things she was anxious about, with 3 rabbits and an expression she didn't immediately recognize, which turned out to be something between satisfaction and something harder to name. He cleaned the rabbits at the exterior hook in his efficient way, and she prepared them in hers, the broth reserved, the meat portioned, the small remaining stores of dried herbs used with the deliberation of someone who knows exactly what she has and has already decided what it's worth. They ate in the firelight, which they always did. The meals had become, without either of them explicitly making it so, the organizing moment of the day, the point around which everything else arranged itself. She had not noticed exactly when that happened, the way you don't notice a path forming until it's already clear enough to follow. "There's something I want to ask you," Silas said. She looked up from her bowl. "When the pass opens," he said. He stopped, looked at the fire, started again with the particular deliberateness of a man choosing words the way he chose footholds on uncertain terrain. "You'll be able to go, to the valley towns. There's enough in the supply cache, gold, pelts, to set you up somewhere decent." He paused again. "Somewhere you could build something, without—" He gestured briefly, an unfinished motion that encompassed the cabin, the mountain, himself, all of this. Abigail set her bowl down. She looked at him for a moment, at this man who had spent 11 years making himself sufficient and had been, she knew, genuinely surprised to discover that sufficiency was not the same thing as enough. "Is that what you want?" she said. "For me to go?" He looked at the fire for a long moment. "It's not about what I want. It's directly about what you want," she said, with the quiet directness that had become her default with him. "That's what you're asking. So answer honestly." The fire moved. Outside, the temperature that had briefly, hopefully risen was falling again with nightfall, the mountain reasserting itself in the way it always did. "No," he said, "it's not what I want." The words settled into the room. She picked up her bowl again. "Then we'll discuss what comes next when the pass opens," she said, "and not before." He looked at her then, fully, in the direct way he'd been avoiding more than usual over the past week, with the expression of a man who has been alone long enough to have forgotten how to want something and is now experiencing the complicated business of remembering. "You're the most stubborn person I've ever met," he said. "You've met 12 people in 11 years, she said. "That's not a large sample." Something happened at the corner of his mouth, then his shoulder, then the whole careful architecture of his face, and Silas Granger laughed, really laughed, for what she suspected was the first time in a very long time, and the sound of it filled the cabin the way warmth fills a room, completely, in every corner, all the way to the ceiling. Abigail Rowan sat across the table from him and felt the sound of it settle into her chest, like something she hadn't known she was missing until it arrived. Outside, the Blackridge winter held the mountain in its long, indifferent grip. The cold pressed against the cabin walls the same way it had pressed against them every night for months. The wolves were gone. The food stores were adequate. The fire burned clean through the repaired baffle, throwing steady heat into every corner of the room. The woman who had been abandoned in a frozen pass with a flint and a knife and 38 rose hips looked at the man across the fire and understood, with the same clarity she'd brought to every calculation that had kept her alive this winter, that strength was not a fixed thing. It was not measured once and recorded. It was something you discovered in increments, each time the mountain asked you a question you hadn't expected. Each time the answer you gave turned out to be better than you'd known you had in you. She had been left because someone had looked at her and seen only what she cost. She had survived because she knew, even when no one else did, what she was worth. The fire burned on. The winter moved toward its end at the pace that winters moved, unhurried, inevitable, indifferent to how anyone felt about it. And in the cabin on the eastern face of the Blackridge Mountains, for the first time in longer than either of them could clearly remember, neither person was alone. February came in the way it always did in the Blackridge Range. Not gently, not with any suggestion of the season turning, but with a final, consolidating cold that seemed determined to establish, beyond any remaining doubt, exactly who was in charge of this mountain and everything on it. Abigail had stopped being intimidated by the cold sometime in January. Not because it had become less dangerous, it hadn't, but because she had learned the difference between weather that was trying to kill you and weather that was simply indifferent to whether you lived. The distinction mattered. Malice required a response. Indifference only required preparation. She prepared. Every day, in every way available to her, she prepared. The food stores that she'd calculated in December to be adequate through late February were, through her management, still holding reasonable depth in the first week of March. Not comfortable. They were past comfortable by a wide margin, into the territory of deliberate and careful, where every meal was planned 2 days in advance, and nothing was used for one purpose if it could serve two, but they were holding. That was what mattered. Silas's leg had healed to the point where he ran the full trap line daily, without the limp she'd monitored anxiously through January and into February. The scar was there, would always be there, a lateral ridge on the outer thigh that he'd probably carry another 50 years. But the tissue had knitted cleanly, and she'd taken the last of her improvised stitches out on a cold morning in early February while he sat at the table with his usual expression of determined unconcern, and she worked with the careful hands of someone who understood that the quality of this moment was the final accounting of every decision she'd made the night he fell through the door. "Clean," she'd said, setting the last thread aside. He'd looked down at it. "You were right about the honey." "My grandfather was right about the honey," she'd said. "I just remembered it." "Same thing," he'd said, and she'd found to her own mild surprise that she agreed. The conversation they'd half begun in January, the one about the pass opening, about what came next, did not come up again directly for a long time. It existed between them the way certain things exist between two people who have been through something together, not forgotten, not avoided, but set aside by mutual unspoken agreement until the conditions were right for it. Until winter had said what it had to say, and they could think about spring without it feeling presumptuous. What happened instead was that they talked about other things, and through those other things, the larger question answered itself gradually, the way most important things do. Silas began describing the property in detail one evening, not as a declaration of anything, but in the way of a man working through something practical and finding he wanted a second mind on it. The eastern tree line was the natural boundary of the cleared ground, he said, but 50 yards further east the terrain leveled off into a long, flat shelf of ground that caught the morning sun from the south-facing ridge above it, protected from the north wind by the granite shoulder. Good drainage, he thought. The snow melted off it first every spring. He'd thought about it over the years, about what that ground might do if it was worked. Abigail had her bowl in her hands, and she was listening with the particular quality of attention she brought to things that mattered. "How long is the shelf?" she asked. 80 feet, maybe 90, 40 wide. "That's enough for a serious kitchen garden," she said. "Enough for root vegetables and the hardier greens. You'd need to test the soil depth before you planned anything permanent. If you're sitting on granite at 18 inches, you'd be building up rather than down. But the sun exposure you're describing is good." She paused. Better than good. He was looking at her in the particular way he'd developed over the winter, not the narrow, assessing look of the first weeks, but something more open, something that had room in it. "You know about gardens?" "My grandmother kept one. I kept it with her from the time I was 7 until the year she died." She turned her bowl in her hands. "There's something about a garden, the way it requires you to think in seasons rather than days. You can't be impatient with a garden. It runs on its own schedule, and you either respect that or you don't eat." "Sounds like the mountain," he said. She considered that. "Yes," she said, "but more forgiving." He was quiet for a moment, then, "I have seeds. In the supply chest, the sealed tin near the bottom. I brought them up 4 years ago. Thought I might try, but never—" He stopped, shrugged, which was his shorthand for a longer explanation he'd decided wasn't necessary. "Never had a reason to?" she said, without weight, without accusation. "Never had the time," he said, which they both understood was not exactly the same thing. She nodded, didn't push. "What kind?" "Turnip, beet, carrot." He paused. "Some squash, I think. Might not be viable anymore after 4 years." "We can test them," she said, "before the ground thaws. Wet cloth, warm corner of the cabin. Anything that germinates in the first 10 days is still good." She looked at the fire. "If the shelf is what you're describing, and if the seeds test out, we could have root vegetables by September. Not abundance, but enough to change the winter supply calculation significantly." Silas looked at the fire beside her. Something in the line of his shoulders had settled, the way a thing settles when it finds the position it was meant to hold. "We," he said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't quite a statement. It was something in between, a word held out carefully, the way you hold out your hand to an animal you're not entirely certain of yet. Abigail looked at him. "We," she confirmed, with the same quiet certainty she'd used the night she told him she'd run the trapline. As a fact. Established. Not requiring extended discussion. He nodded once, looked back at the fire. "All right," he said. And that was how it was decided, without ceremony and without drama, in the way that the most important decisions of their lives had both been made. Not in a grand moment, but in a quiet one, by two people who had both learned through very different paths that the things most worth having rarely announce themselves with fanfare. March arrived and the mountain began its slow, grudging negotiation with the season. It was not a quick process. The Black Ridge Range did not surrender winter casually. It released it in increments, a degree at a time, the snowpack compressing and crusting over rather than melting cleanly. The trees dripping in the afternoons and freezing again at night, so that the forest glittered in the morning with a cold that still had teeth. But the light changed. That was the thing you noticed first, before the temperature, before the melt. The light came in at a different angle, stayed longer, carried something in it that winter light didn't have, a quality almost like intention, as though it had somewhere to be. Abigail noticed it one morning in the second week of March, standing at the cabin window with her pine needle tea while Silas was still lacing his boots for the trapline, and something moved through her that she hadn't felt in a long time. Not happiness exactly. Happiness was too simple a word for something this layered. But its more durable cousin. Contentment. The specific, earned contentment of a person who has come through something that tried to break them and has emerged with more rather than less. She thought about this day she'd walked across the snow toward this cabin. The way she'd counted every step with her staff, not permitting herself to slow down or to think too hard about what it would mean if the smoke turned out to be something other than what she hoped. She thought about the door opening and the large, bearded, deeply skeptical man on the other side, and the bare calculation she'd offered him. I have a flint and a knife. I'll work for what I need. She had meant it, and she had done it. And whatever came next, that was a fact that belonged to her in a way that nothing could touch. You're thinking again, Silas said from behind her. He'd come up quietly, the way he moved through the cabin, with the unconscious, trained silence of a man who'd spent 11 years in a forest. I'm always thinking, she said. This is the particular kind, he said, where you go very still. She turned from the window. He was standing near the table, fully ready for the trapline, studying her with the open expression that had replaced the narrow one sometime in January and never gone back. I was thinking about the day I arrived, she said. Were you? I was thinking about what I said to you at the door. She wrapped both hands around the cup. That I'd work for what I needed. I remember. I didn't know then what I needed, she said. I thought I did. Food, shelter, warmth, enough time to think about what came next. Survival requirements. She paused. I didn't know the rest of it was missing until it wasn't. Silas was quiet for a moment. He had the look of a man who is following something carefully because he understands it matters and doesn't want to lose the thread. The rest of it, he said. Someone who looked at me and saw what was actually there, she said simply. Not what I cost, not what I required. What was there? He held her gaze steadily. I saw it on the first day, he said. When you came through the door. I didn't know what to do with it, but I saw it. I know, she said. That's why I stayed. He picked up his pack from the hook. At the door he paused, which was not his usual practice. Silas left and returned with the same efficiency he brought to everything, without theatrical pausing. The seed tin, he said. Bottom of the chest. Try the squash first. If anything's going to surprise you after 4 years, it'll be that. She looked at him. For the garden, he said, with the elaborate casualness of a man who has thought about something considerably more than he intends to admit. I know what it's for, she said. He went out. She heard his boots on the frozen ground, steady and even, until the forest took the sound. Then she put down her cup and went to the supply chest and found the seed tin at the bottom, exactly where he'd said. Spring came to the Black Ridge Range the way it always had and always would, on its own schedule, indifferent to how badly it was wanted, arriving first in the places that faced south and last in the shadows of the north-facing rocks, where winter liked to linger longest. By the middle of April, the shelf of ground east of the cabin was clear of snow for the first time, and Abigail stood on it in the thin spring sunlight with a stick and tested the soil depth in a dozen places, while Silas stood at the edge of the cleared ground and watched. 14 inches at the shallowest, she reported, 2 feet plus along the southern edge where the drainage is best. She straightened, pressing a hand to her hip in the automatic, unself-conscious way she'd stopped hiding around him sometime in February. The squash will need the south edge. Everything else can go in rows across the main section. How do you want to lay it out? He said. She looked at the shelf of ground. In her mind, she could already see it. Not as it was, bare and frost-hardened, but as it would be in July, in August, the green architecture of a working garden in full season. She'd been planning it since March, adjusting the layout as she learned more about the soil and the light and the way water would move across the surface when the snow fully released. Root vegetables in the north section. They can handle less direct light once they're established. Greens in the center where the soil is deepest. Squash along the south edge where the sun hits longest. She looked at him. I'll need to build a cold frame for the seedlings before the last frost. Do you have extra glass anywhere? Even a single pane? There's a broken window pane in the stable, he said. From 2 winters ago. I kept it. Of course he had. Silas kept everything that might be useful, which had turned out to be, she reflected, one of the most genuinely attractive qualities in a person that she had ever encountered. That's enough for a small frame, she said. I can build the box from the spare timber on the south side of the woodpile. I'll cut what you need, he said. You don't have to. I know I don't have to, he said, with the patient precision of a man who had said something similar to her a number of times and fully expected to say it a number of times more. I want to. She looked at him for a moment, standing there in the spring light on the edge of what was going to be their garden, with the mountain behind him and the cabin beside him, and 11 years of chosen solitude written in his face alongside something newer, something that was still finding its shape. She thought, not for the first time, that the word the world had always used for people like her, burden, liability, inconvenience, said more about the poverty of the world's imagination than it said about her. She had carried 60 pounds of wood through a blizzard on a bad hip and found a fire in the dark. She had stretched scarce food through the deep of winter and kept a man alive through fever, and sutured his wounds and outthought a wolf pack in the middle of the night. She had done all of this, and she had done it with the body that the people who loved her had decided wasn't worth saving. That thought used to arrive with heat. Now it arrived with something quieter. Not forgiveness. She was honest enough with herself not to confuse resolution with forgiveness. But something like perspective. The understanding that what had been done to her said nothing about her, and everything about the fear and smallness of people who encountered something they couldn't categorize and responded by throwing it away. She was not thrown away. She was here. She was exactly where she was meant to be, on a mountain that had tried to kill her and failed, in a life she had built with her own hands from the materials available. "All right," she said, "cut the timber. I'll plan the frame dimensions tonight." They broke ground in the third week of April, working the shelf together on a morning that was cold enough to see their breath, but warm enough that the soil turned without breaking, the frost gone from the top 8 inches for the first time. Silas handled the heavier turning with a spade, while Abigail worked behind him on her knees, breaking clods and removing stones and checking the texture of the soil with her hands, the way her grandmother had taught her. Feeling for the composition that told you whether you were working with something alive or something merely inert. It was alive, thin and rocky in places, needing amendment, but alive. The dark, faintly sweet smell of soil that had been building organic matter under the forest duff for decades, and was willing, now that the light was reaching it, to do something with it. "It's good," she said. She was kneeling in the turned earth with her hands in it, and she was smiling in the unguarded way she smiled when something turned out better than she'd allowed herself to hope. "Better than I expected. We'll need to add what we can from the stable compost, but this is genuinely good ground, Silas." He was leaning on the spade, looking at her with the expression she'd stopped noticing consciously, because it had become the ordinary texture of how he looked at her, that open, recalibrated expression that had been replacing the old narrow one inch by inch all winter. "My grandmother would have said the same thing," he said. She looked up, surprised. He rarely mentioned family, rarely mentioned any life before the mountain. He seemed to recognize the rarity of it himself. "She kept a garden," he said, "back in Ohio, big one. She used to say," he paused, the way he paused when he was being careful with something. "She used to say that a garden was the most honest relationship you'd ever have. It gave back exactly what you put in. No more, no less." Abigail sat back on her heels and looked at the turned earth and thought about that. "She sounds like she was a wise woman." "She was the wisest person I knew," he said simply, "and the most patient." "You should have introduced me," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Something moved in his face, past the habitual reserve, into something genuine and almost young. "She would have liked you," he said. "Very much." They worked until noon when the spring sun was high enough to carry actual warmth on its surface, and the turned earth steamed faintly in the way that good soil steams when it wakes up. Abigail's hip was aching from the kneeling, and she'd switched to a low stool Silas had built for her without being asked, sometime in February, that she used for work close to the ground. She hadn't commented on it when he produced it. She'd simply used it. Some things didn't require words, and she'd learned, living with Silas Granger, that identifying which things those were was its own kind of skill. In the second week of May, the Harrow Pass opened. She knew it before Silas told her. She'd been watching the snow level on the peak above the pass approach for 2 weeks, counting degrees and making calculations, and she knew within 2 days of when it would happen. When Silas came back from a ranging trip north and said the pass was clear, she nodded and said, "I thought it would be today or tomorrow." He looked at her. "You've been tracking it." "Since April," she said. He set down his pack. He didn't ask why she'd been tracking it. He knew why she'd been tracking it. It was the same reason he'd gone to check it this morning without mentioning he was going to. They both needed to know. She'd thought about this moment through the winter, about what she would feel when it came. She'd expected something more complicated than what she actually felt. Some unresolved pull toward the world on the other side of the mountain, or grief for the family she'd never fully had, or anxiety about what choosing this particular life over the alternatives meant. She'd expected the complexity that decisions of this magnitude are supposed to carry. What she felt, standing in the May light with the pass open behind the peaks, was very simple. She was home. Not in the sense of a place she'd been before, in the sense of a place that matched the shape of who she actually was, who she'd discovered herself to be over the course of a winter that had asked her everything and gotten honest answers every time. "I'm not going through it," she said. Silas, who had been watching her with careful attention, let out a breath that was not quite audible. "No? No." She turned from the direction of the pass to look at the cabin, at the cold frame with its green seedlings already showing through the glass, at the turned earth of the garden in its careful rows, at the woodpile she'd maintained all winter, at the stable where Colt regarded the spring morning with her customary composed indifference. She looked at all of it and felt the particular satisfaction of a person looking at something they have had a hand in building. "I have seeds in the ground," she said. "I'm not leaving seeds in the ground." Silas said nothing for a long moment. She could see him, in her peripheral vision, looking at the same things she was looking at: the cabin, the garden, the evidence of a winter survived and something more than survival achieved. "The cabin needs a second room," he said finally, in the tone of a man approaching a practical matter. She looked at him. "It does," she agreed. "The north wall is the logical extension. The roofline already runs in that direction, and the existing structure can take the load if we sister the joists on the east side." He blinked. "You've been thinking about this?" "Since January," she said. "Since January." "The night you asked me about staying," she said. "While you were looking at the fire, I was looking at the north wall." He stared at her for a moment. Then he looked at the north wall of the cabin with an expression she could only describe as outmaneuvered. Not unkindly, but genuinely, the expression of a man who has realized that several conversations he thought were preliminary were actually conclusions that had already been reached. "The timber on the east slope is good," he said at last. "There's a stand of mature spruce that needs thinning. I've been thinking about it for a year. How many trees would we need?" He thought about it. She could see him doing the calculations the way he did all calculations, thoroughly and without rushing. 20, maybe 22 if we want the ceiling high enough. "Then we start after the garden is established," she said. "June at the earliest. The seedlings need another month before they don't need daily management." "June," he agreed. She turned back to the garden and picked up the small trowel she'd been using to thin the carrot seedlings before this conversation had begun, because the carrot seedlings needed thinning regardless of what was being decided about the larger shape of their lives. And she was a person who finished what she started. She heard Silas behind her, the sound of him picking up the spade, the particular rhythm of his footsteps crossing the cleared ground to the section he'd been working on the previous day. He moved up beside her and began working the adjacent row. And they were quiet together in the May sunshine in the way they were quiet together best, which was not like silence at all, but like conversation conducted through the medium of proximity and shared work. "Abigail," he said after a while. She kept her hands in the soil. "Yes." "The gold I mentioned. In the supply cache." He paused. "I wasn't offering it as a way out. I want you to know that. I offered it because I thought—" He stopped. Restarted with the deliberateness he brought to things that mattered. "I didn't want you to feel that staying was the only option because leaving wasn't possible." She thought about this carefully, the way it deserved to be thought about. She knew what he was saying. He was saying that the choice had to be real, that choosing to stay only meant something if going had been genuinely available. "I know," she said. "That's why it meant something when I chose to stay." He was quiet for a moment. "Good," he said simply, and went back to his row. She went back to hers. The garden grew between them in its rows, the first of many she knew, the foundation of something that would expand and change and become more than its current form over the seasons to come. The cold frame would come down when the last frost passed, and the seedlings would go into the ground, and the ground would do what good ground did when tended by people who understood what it needed. The cabin would have a second room by fall. She'd already planned where her shelves would go, the medical stores on the east wall, the books they'd been trading back and forth all winter on the west, the small writing table she intended to build from the leftover timber because she'd discovered over the course of this winter that she had things she wanted to put down in words, things she'd learned and thought and understood that she didn't want to carry only in her memory. The trapline would continue. She would run the eastern section. Silas would run the full circuit. They would split the management of the food stores and the wood supply and the 100 small decisions that keeping a homestead alive through a Blackridge winter required, and they would make those decisions together because they had discovered, over the course of one of the hardest winters either of them had lived, that two people thinking about the same problem from the same foundation of trust consistently produced better answers than one person thinking alone. She had not known, the day she walked out of the trees toward a column of smoke, that she was walking toward the life she actually wanted. She'd known only that she needed warmth and food and enough time to think, but the life she wanted had been waiting here anyway, the way certain things wait, without urgency, without impatience, because they know what they are and are willing to let the right person find them when the right person is ready. She thought one more time about her father's calculations, about the cold arithmetic of a man measuring what she cost against what she contributed and finding the numbers unsatisfactory. She thought about what he didn't know how to measure, the things that don't show up in weight calculations or pace assessments, the things that only become visible when conditions are bad enough to require them. Steadiness, resourcefulness, the ability to look at a situation with clear eyes and find the workable path through it when the obvious path has closed. Her family had left her to die in a mountain pass. She had not died. She had done something considerably more permanent than survive. She had built. She pressed her hands into the good dark earth of the garden and felt the living complexity of it against her palms, the weight and texture of something that was already, in its slow vegetable way, becoming what it was meant to become. Above the eastern ridge, a hawk turned in the warm May air, riding a thermal with the effortless patience of something that had learned to use what the world offered rather than fight against what it withheld. Abigail Rowan watched it for a moment, her hands in the earth, the sun on her back, the man she trusted working the row beside her. Then she bent back to the work. There was so much of it, good work, work worth doing. The garden was only the beginning. She intended to be here for all of it,